Hey guys, it's Bub here, and today I'll be building my first custom-built computer. The parts I will be using consists of an MSI Z490 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi motherboard, a 10th generation Core i7-10700K, a Samsung 970 EVO SSD, 32GB of Corsair RM750 RAM, a 2TB Barracuda SSD, an RM750 power supply, a Dark Rock Pro 4 for that Core i7, and of course the NZXT H510. Some things to note before watching this video. Number 1, this is my first PC build. Some stuff will not be perfect. Number 2, please do not say that some of my parts are overpriced or too cheap. I am very happy with the final result and I could not have asked for a better computer. Number 3, yes, I chose an Intel processor. I simply did not want AMD, and what I planned for using this computer for, an Intel processor better suited me anyway. Number 4, you don't have a graphics card. Yes, I'm aware. For the first month or so, I'll be running off the iGPU on the i7, which is the UHD 630 graphics. However, in October, I plan on purchasing an RTX 3070 to add to this build, which is why I wanted a modular power supply to ensure that I had support for the RTX 3070 Founders Edition. Number 5. Please do not use this video as a build guide. This is just an overview of my PC build. I'm sure that I messed some things up, and I'm sure there's going to be people yelling at me in the comments, but please do not use this video as a guide. With that being said, we can now unbox our MSI MPG Z490 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. I needed a Wi-Fi board simply because I could not run Ethernet to my room, and Wi-Fi just works fine for me anyway. The first thing that we can see in the box is of course the motherboard itself. Setting that aside, we have a whole bunch of documentation, DVD drives, SATA cables, and screws. We'll probably need these later. Now, being careful with what I touch and being grounded to the PC case, I can carefully remove the motherboard from its anti-static bag. We can set the motherboard on top of the motherboard box as an anti-static surface to work on. And now we can unbox our processor. Of course, like I said, I chose an i7-10700K simply because what I use processors for, this Intel would benefit me more than an AMD Ryzen chip. And this processor was actually lighter than I thought it would be. I don't know what I was expecting. Once the processor was outside of the box, it was now time to prep our motherboard. I can carefully push down on the lever that holds the socket down in place and lift it up carefully. Now, grabbing the CPU and taking it out of its little plastic enclosure, I can make sure that the arrow and the arrow on the socket align, and then carefully let the processor drop down into place. I was really worried about getting the pins aligned since Intel motherboards have the pins on the socket and not the processor. However, this was an easy peasy step, and I had no problems whatsoever installing the processor. Once the processor was installed, I can flip the socket cover down and then push the lever down and making sure that I hear a click. Now, I don't apply too much force here because I don't want to break the processor, but it did involve some more force than I would have liked to given it. Once I push it down and lock the lever down in place, the little socket cover will pop out, and you can save this if you ever have to send back your motherboard. Now it's time to install the RAM. For this, I chose Corsair Vengeance LPX 32GB 3200MHz RAM. In this configuration, it was a 2x16 configuration, which allows me to have 2 extra DIMM slots if I ever wanted to upgrade to 64GB in the future. And this was cheaper than buying 2 8x2 configurations. Now, in the motherboard manual, it explained how to install the RAM. If you're installing 4 sticks, you just simply put them all in at the same time. However, since I'm only installing 2 sticks, you have to put them in certain DIMM slots. For me, it was the 2nd DIMM slot and the 4th DIMM slot. Making sure that the notch is aligned with the notch on the DIMM, I can carefully click this in until I hear a click from both sides. Once one stick is in, I can of course add the other one in the other DIMM slot. Now, let's install the SSD. For this, I chose a Samsung 970 EVO 500GB M.2 SSD. For this computer, this is all I really need. It's a 500GB boot drive because I also have that 2TB hard drive for games and extra data storage. Since my motherboard has a heatsink that goes over the SSD, I have to unscrew that first before I can install it. Once it's unscrewed, I can carefully lift it up out of the motherboard and then get ready to install the Samsung 970 EVO. I can now take the 970 EVO, slide it in the M.2 slot at around a 40-degree angle, and then screw it in with one of the screws that came with my motherboard. Once that is complete, I can remove the plastic covering on the bottom of the heatsink, and then put it right over the SSD. After that, I can screw both screws down, making sure that the SSD and the heatsink are nice and firm in place. At this point, it was time to unbox the brick. The brick is what I call the DarkRock Pro 4 from Be Quiet. I chose this air cooler because it was one of the beefiest and most efficient air coolers I could find. I did not want an AIO or a water cooler simply because A, they were more expensive, and B, I really don't trust water cooling, or I don't trust myself with water cooling, because if one tube breaks, the entire computer pretty much is gone in an instant. This heatsink keeps my processor very cool, and it's silent, meaning it's perfect for what I need it for. After about an hour of looking up how in the world to install this air cooler, I finally figured out. The first step is to take that Intel bracket and make sure the screws and the locks are in place. Once that is done, we can flip the motherboard over to reveal the back of the socket. Here, we can screw those screws into the holes in the motherboard, and then on the top put standoffs on them. This will allow us to have mounting points for the cooler, as well as making sure this bracket is in place so the cooler doesn't easily fall off the motherboard. I thought that the processor would be the hardest part of building a computer. However, I was wrong. The processor cooler was the hardest part. One of the reasons to this is because of the lack of documentation for the LGA 1200 socket. Be Quiet had came out and said that the DarkRock Pro 4 will work with an LGA 1200 socket, but there is no official documentation on it. There's documentation for the LGA 1151 as well as AMD sockets, but none for the 1200 as the DarkRock Pro 4 came out before the 1200 was announced. So I had to do a lot of research online and a lot of trial and error to get this to work. However, once the bracket and the standoffs were installed, we can now put the brackets on the top of the board and get ready for the actual cooler installation. Now, before I could put the cooler on the i7-10700K, I had to unscrew these two thumb screws. This will allow us to get access to the screws we have to put in on the motherboard. Now for thermal paste, I used the pre-installed high performance stuff. I did this simply because I was not too impressed with the performance of the Arctic MX4 when I installed it on my MacBook Pro. So I figured I'd give this a chance, and if all else fails, I could of course take the cooler off, wipe off the thermal paste, and then apply some new stuff. It's time to put the cooler on the processor. Now I was very careful with this step, making sure to not mess anything up, because if I messed up the processor, I would be very disappointed as it's a very expensive component. I had to make sure that I had actually taken the sticker off the bottom of the heatsink before applying it, because I almost forgot about that. Once the sticker was taken off, I can take this little bracket out, trying to figure out where it even went, and then carefully applied the brick onto the processor. This was a very challenging and very nervous moment for me because I did not want to mess up the processor, as I said. After the heatsink was safely in place, I can take the extended screwdriver and screw the screws down onto the brackets that we installed earlier. After this, I had to figure out how to install the middle fan in the heatsink. Turns out it was pretty simple. You take the thin little metal brackets, put them in the holes on the fan, put the fan in the middle of the heatsink, and then latch those little things onto the side of the heatsink fins. It's pretty simple, and I did not get a chance to get it on camera. After the heatsink is installed, I can connect the power splitter to the header on the motherboard, and then connect both fans into the power splitter. It's now time to put the motherboard inside of the case. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, I decided to use an NZXT H510. Now, as a little bit of a warning, from this point on, the camera angles and the quality aren't that good, as I was simply getting frustrated with trying to get this thing to fit inside of the case. So I highly apologize for that, however, I'll make up for it at the end of this video. I can now take the motherboard, grabbing it only by the heatsink or the fans, and then carefully slot it at an angle into the case. Now, my motherboard already had a pre-installed I/O shield, so there was no need to worry about that. Now, this was a very stressful step because I had so many components on a board that I could so easily mess up. However, thankfully, I didn't. I carefully slotted this into place with a little bit of force, probably not as much as I should have used because I was so worried about it. I wiggled it in place, making sure that all the standoffs were aligned correctly, and then we could start screwing it into place. Using the pre-installed standoffs and case screws, it was actually pretty simple to install the screws into the standard ATX layout. It was now time to cable manage and plug in all of the wires that were in the case. Now, I did a very horrible job at filming this, so at this point and this point on, I'll pretty much just show a recap of what I did instead of the process of actually doing it, simply because A, the camera was in my way, and B, like I said, for some reason I overlooked filming this part. All of the case front panel connectors were now connected to the motherboard. It is now time to unbox our 750 watt modular power supply from Corsair. After unboxing and connecting all the appropriate cables that I need, I can then install the power supply. I found that it was actually easier to connect all my cables before actually putting it in the case. After making sure that everything was connected, all of the power supply cables were connected to the appropriate connectors on the motherboard, I decided to hook my computer up to power and a display so I can see it boot for the first time, or hopefully boot for the first time. So pressing the power button, we got a light. We had the lights on the motherboard light up, the CPU cooler spin, and the keyboard and the display decided to light up, and we booted into the BIOS. I was very happy to see this because I knew I didn't mess up my computer. After I made sure that my computer could boot up with only the critical components installed, I could then unscrew the drive bay from the bottom of the case and install my 2TB hard drive. So slotting it into place, I can screw it in with the 6 screws on the side and then connect it using SATA and power. After this, I could cable manage, which I'm not too good at that, so I didn't show that on camera, but we're done. And that concludes my first PC build ever. I'm very happy with the final result, and I think once I get the 3070 installed, I will love it even more. However, surprisingly, the integrated UHD 630 graphics run pretty well, and I didn't think I would ever say that. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're new around here, and yeah, I will see you all in the next one.